The invitation came through a casual text message from her husband. "Dinner with my boss tonight. He wants to meet you. Says it's important." She stared at the message for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen before she replied. "Sounds great. What time?" It wasn't unusual for his boss to invite them out. He had mentioned it before, but something about this felt different. Her husband rarely had time for things outside of work, yet suddenly tonight was important enough for dinner plans. She smoothed down her dress in the mirror before they left, adjusting her earrings. Her husband glanced at her as he tied his shoes. "You look amazing." She smiled, though something about the compliment felt routine, like something he said out of habit rather than admiration. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place reserved for important meetings and celebrations. They walked in, and almost immediately she saw him. The boss stood near the bar, commanding attention without trying. He was tall, confident, effortlessly charismatic. When he turned toward them, his smile was charming but unreadable. Her husband reached out to shake his hand. "Thanks for inviting us." His boss nodded, eyes shifting toward her. "And you must be his lovely wife." She smiled politely as they exchanged greetings, but the way he held her gaze a moment too long made something stir inside her. She dismissed it quickly. It was nothing. The dinner started normally, conversations about work, promotions, projects her husband was handling. But every now and then his boss turned his attention to her. He asked about her life, her interests, things that had nothing to do with the company. He was smooth with his words, careful with his compliments, never crossing the line, but something about the way he spoke to her felt different. "You must be very patient," he said, sipping his drink. "Your husband is always at the office. It must be hard not having him around much." She glanced at her husband, who was checking his phone, probably responding to an email. She forced a small laugh. "You get used to it." His boss raised an eyebrow. "Should you have to?" Something about the question made her pause. Before she could answer, her husband looked up, chuckling. "She's a saint for putting up with me." She smiled, playing along, but the words lingered. As the evening went on, the conversation shifted, and soon her husband and his boss were discussing an upcoming business trip. She listened quietly, sipping her wine, but she could feel the boss's gaze on her now and then, like he was studying her. When the check arrived, he insisted on covering it. "Consider it a small token of appreciation for the hard work your husband puts in." Her husband laughed, shaking his hand in gratitude. "We really appreciate it." As they stood up to leave, the boss turned to her again. "It was great meeting you. I hope we get to do this again soon." She nodded, offering a polite smile, but when he walked away, she realized something. Her heart was racing. It was just a dinner, a harmless conversation, a simple exchange of pleasantries. So why did it feel like something more? The message came late at night, long after her husband had fallen asleep. "It was great meeting you. We should all do this again sometime." She read it twice, her pulse quickening. It was innocent, at least on the surface, but something about it felt different. The dinner had been normal, hadn't it? Just casual conversation, polite exchanges. And yet she knew there had been something unspoken between them. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she typed back, "Likewise, thanks for dinner." She sent it quickly, locking her phone and setting it on the nightstand. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind replayed every moment from earlier, the way his eyes had lingered on her across the table, the way he had steered the conversation toward her instead of her husband, the way his voice had softened when he said her name. It was nothing, and yet she felt something. The next morning she pushed the thoughts away. Her husband was already up, drinking coffee, reading emails, as if nothing had changed. "Late night text from your boss," she said casually, taking a sip of her own coffee. He nodded without looking up. Yeah, he's just being polite, I'm sure. Probably wants to plan another dinner. That was it. No suspicion, no concern. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt disappointed. As the day passed, she found herself checking her phone more often than usual, wondering if there would be another message, wondering if she wanted one. By late afternoon, her phone buzzed again. Hope you're having a good day. She hesitated for only a moment before replying. You too. It was short, simple, harmless. But it wasn't harmless at all. That night she lay beside her husband, scrolling through her phone, feeling an unfamiliar sense of guilt mixed with something else, anticipation. Days passed, and their messages remained light, friendly but never inappropriate. And yet she felt herself drawn into them more and more. Her husband was too busy to notice. His long hours at work, his exhaustion when he got home, his constant preoccupation with his phone and laptop, all of it made it easy. She told herself it was just talking. But then came the second invitation, another dinner, but this time her husband had to travel for work. You two should go without me, he said without a second thought. Her heart skipped a beat. Just me and him? He shrugged. Why not? He likes talking to you. Besides, it's just dinner. It was just dinner. She told herself that all the way to the restaurant, all through the first glass of wine, and especially when he leaned in slightly, his voice lower than before. You look beautiful tonight. She should have shut it down. She should have changed the subject, laughed it off, done anything but let his words sink into her the way they did. Instead, she smiled. And, for the first time, she didn't feel guilty at all. The messages became more frequent. What started as a polite exchange after dinner soon turned into casual check-ins throughout the day. Busy day? Not too bad. You? Long meetings? You're the highlight of my day, honestly. She stared at the message for longer than she should have. A compliment, but not quite a compliment. She told herself it was innocent. Just small talk, but small talk didn't make her heart race. She typed back, "Glad I can make your day a little better?" He responded almost immediately, "You do more than that." Her breath caught. This was dangerous. She locked her phone and set it aside, but the words stayed with her. At first she told her husband everything. "Your boss texted me today, just a quick check-in." He never reacted. "That's nice of him." That was all, no suspicion, no concern. So she stopped mentioning it, and then she started deleting the messages. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't cheating, she wasn't even flirting. But something about it felt like a secret, and secrets had a way of growing. One evening, her phone buzzed while her husband was beside her on the couch. She flipped it over quickly, heart pounding. "Who was that?" he asked, not looking up from his laptop. "No one, just a work email." Lying felt so easy. And that scared her. The next time they met, she barely hesitated. It wasn't planned. She had gone out for coffee in the middle of the day, desperate for a break from the monotony of her routine. He happened to be there, waiting for a meeting that had just been cancelled. "You should sit," he said, smiling. And she did. It felt different than the first dinner, more comfortable. They talked about everything but work. He asked about her life, about the things she wanted, the things she missed. "You must get lonely sometimes," he said, stirring his coffee. She hesitated. "Why would you say that?" He smiled knowingly. "Because I see how much he works. I see how much you're left alone." She felt her throat tighten. "I don't mind," she said, but the words felt weak. "Of course you don't," he said softly. "Because you love him." She nodded, but something inside her twisted. "Still," he continued, holding her gaze, "love doesn't mean you don't deserve attention." The air between them felt heavier. She should have left then, She didn't. They lingered over their coffee. He told her about his past relationships, the ones that didn't work, the women who misunderstood him. He made her feel like he understood her, and for the first time she didn't fight it. When they stood to leave, he placed a hand on her back. Just a brief touch. It should have meant nothing, but when she got home, her skin still burned where his fingers had been. She didn't tell her husband about the coffee, and she didn't delete the messages that night. The invitation came unexpectedly. Her husband had mentioned the business trip weeks ago, but he hadn't been able to make it work with his schedule. Then, just a few days before the event, his boss called her directly. "It's a shame your husband won't be able to attend, but you should still come." She hesitated. "Me? Of course. You've been part of the conversations. It would be a great opportunity for you to see everything firsthand." Her husband had encouraged her. "You'll represent me well. Besides, it's just a few days. It'll be good for you to get out." So she packed her bags, and deep down she knew exactly what she was walking into. The flight was uneventful, the hotel luxurious. It was all business at first, meetings, networking events, formal dinners where she played the role of a supportive wife, speaking highly of her husband to people who barely knew him. But in the quiet moments in between, it was just the two of them. His presence was magnetic, the way he leaned in slightly when they spoke, the way his hand brushed against her arm when he guided her through a room, the way he remembered the smallest details from their previous conversations. He made her feel like the most interesting person in the room, and that was something she hadn't felt in years. The night it happened, there were no grand declarations, no dramatic moments, just a knock at her door. Her pulse quickened as she walked toward it, every step heavy, filled with undeniable certainty. She opened the door, and there he was. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. His eyes searched hers, silently asking the question she had already answered before he ever arrived. She stepped back. He stepped in. The door closed behind him. The moment their lips met, everything changed. Guilt didn't stop her. It didn't even slow her down. It wasn't until the next morning, lying in an unfamiliar bed, tangled in sheets that weren't hers, that reality hit her. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The trip ended, and she went home to the man she had betrayed. Her husband wrapped his arms around her the second she walked through the door. "I missed you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She forced a smile, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she missed him too, but the words wouldn't come, because now she was living a lie. She became good at lying. It happened gradually, almost without her realizing it. What started as small, careful excuses turned into an elaborate web of deception. The affair wasn't a one-time mistake. It became a pattern. Late-night messages sent when her husband was in the shower. Long lunch breaks that had nothing to do with lunch. Meetings that never actually existed. At first it was thrilling, the secrecy, the stolen moments, the way his touch lingered long after they parted. It made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She justified it to herself, telling herself that her husband had been absent long before she had ever crossed the line. But keeping the secret became harder. Her husband wasn't stupid. He noticed things. "How come you've been going out so much lately?" he asked one evening as she put on her coat. She froze for just a second before forcing a smile. "Just catching up with friends." He nodded, but something in his eyes told her he didn't believe her. The following week he asked again, "Who were you on the phone with last night?" She shrugged, keeping her voice light. "Just a co-worker, work stuff." He didn't question her further, but he was watching her now. One night, as she lay beside him, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it quickly, flipping it over before he could see the screen. Her husband didn't say anything, but she felt him turn his head toward her, watching. The messages were becoming harder to hide. She started deleting them immediately, making sure there was no evidence left behind. Then, one night, she made a mistake. She had meant to delete the message, but she forgot. It was a simple text, but it was enough. "I can't stop thinking about you." She didn't notice it until it was too late, until she saw her husband standing in the doorway, phone in his hand, the screen lit up with the message she should have erased. His expression was unreadable, but she knew. The air in the room became heavy, suffocating. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Her heart pounded. She opened her mouth, searching for a lie, an excuse, anything that could undo what he had just seen. But nothing came out, because there was no way out of this now. She stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs, watching as her husband's eyes moved over the screen of her phone. The glow of the text illuminated his face, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched unbearably long. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer an explanation, to lie, anything. But the words died in her throat, because what excuse could she possibly give? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply, setting the phone down on the nightstand with deliberate slowness. "How long?" His voice was quiet. Too quiet. She wished he would scream, throw something, demand answers. Anything but this. She swallowed hard. I don't... How long?" he repeated, firmer this time. Her hands trembled. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to make it real. But the truth was already out. "Months," she whispered. His jaw clenched, but his expression didn't change. He just nodded, slowly, as if processing the confirmation of what he had already suspected. "You should have told me," he said, his voice eerily calm. She blinked at him, her chest tightening. "I was going to." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Were you?" She wasn't sure. Maybe she had convinced herself she would stop, that she could fix things before he ever found out. But, deep down, she had known this moment was coming. "I never wanted to hurt you," she choked out, stepping closer. He took a step back. The rejection stung, but she deserved it. For the first time in months, she could see every ounce of love he had for her draining from his eyes. She reached for his hand, desperate to make him feel something, anything. "Please," she whispered, "can we just talk about this?" He stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "There's nothing to talk about." She felt the panic rising in her chest. "No, don't say that. We can fix this. Now, I made a mistake, but A mistake?" His voice was cold now. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something you don't mean in an argument. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "I still love you." His expression darkened. "No, you don't. You don't do this to someone you love." She felt her breath hitch. "I do. I love you. You love the security I gave you," he interrupted. "You love knowing I was always here for you, no matter what. You love the idea of me." His voice broke slightly, but he quickly steadied himself. "But you didn't love me enough to stay faithful." The words hit like a punch to the gut. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please don't leave." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he turned, walked to the closet and pulled out a suitcase. Her stomach twisted. "No," she whispered, "you don't have to do this. We can work through this." He didn't stop. He didn't look at her. He just started packing. She moved toward him, grabbing his arm. Please, just stop for a second. Let's talk. His hand slowly pried hers off of him. I'm done talking. Her breath came out in shaky gasps. You don't mean that. He zipped up the suitcase and turned to face her, and she saw it. The love was gone. The man who had once looked at her like she was his world now looked at her like she was a stranger. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. She ran after him, grabbing his wrist. Wait, where are you going? He shook her off effortlessly. Away from you. The door opened. The cold air rushed in. She stood there, watching the only person who ever truly loved her walk out without looking back. And then he was gone. She sat in the dark, the weight of silence pressing against her like a physical force. The apartment felt emptier than ever. Her husband was gone. She had spent the last few days waiting for him to come back, hoping he would call, text, something, but there was nothing, no messages, no missed calls, no sign that he even thought about her anymore. He had erased her. She had tried reaching out to him. Please, just talk to me, let me explain. I know I hurt you, but I need you. I still love you. But every message went unanswered, and then he blocked her. The finality of it sank in like a stone in her chest. He wasn't giving her a chance to fix this. She had destroyed something that couldn't be repaired. The people she once called family turned away from her too. His sister, who used to call her for advice, had unfollowed her on social media. His mother, who once treated her like a daughter, ignored her calls. Even their mutual friends had picked a side, and it wasn't hers. She had always thought she was in control, that she could balance it all, keep the secret hidden, play both sides without consequence. But she had been wrong. She opened her phone, scrolling past the messages she had sent to her husband, past the unread texts, past the regret-filled calls that went straight to voicemail. There was one person left, the man she had risked everything for. She hesitated before typing his name and pressing call. 1 ring, 2, straight to voicemail. She tried again, blocked. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, but it came out shaky, raw. It was almost laughable. She had thrown away her marriage, her family, her life. For what? For a man who had never cared about her at all. She had been convenient to him, a thrill, something exciting until it became too messy. And now that she had nothing left, he was gone too. Her fingers tightened around her phone as the realization set in. She had lost everything. No husband, no lover, no friends, just regret, and no way to undo what she had done. She stood and walked to the bathroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Her once bright eyes were dull, swollen from days of crying. Her skin looked pale, her lips dry, her hair unkempt. She looked like a stranger, a broken, pathetic version of the woman she once was. She pressed her hands against the counter, taking a shaky breath. She had thought she wanted more, that she deserved more, that she had been missing something, but now she realized she already had everything she needed.